Hi there, my name is Emma and welcome to my channel. I make videos on art, home decor, and DIYs, so if that interests you, feel free to subscribe. Today I'm going to be showing you how I painted my stepping stones to look like faux Roman mosaics. I've been obsessed with Roman mosaics ever since we saw Hearst Castle, which I don't know if they have specifically Roman mosaics. We toured it like a year or two ago, and then when we bought our house, I knew I wanted it somewhere in our house in some form, but I just couldn't figure out how. Real mosaics are incredibly pricey and super time consuming, and on top of that, I don't really have any experience in mosaic. I've done some tiling, but not necessarily mosaic, so I am a painter, so I thought I would come up with a technique to allow myself to be able to paint mosaics. I've done a bunch of experimenting. The first time I talked about this was May of last year, so almost exactly a year ago, I threw out the idea of what if I could paint mosaics, and since then I created a little mini mosaic step in my miniature greenhouse, which is behind me right there. And so I've been thinking about this idea of painting mosaics for a while, and I am so excited about it. I've never seen anyone else do it. I've actually already posted little snippets of this tutorial as a TikTok and an Instagram reel, and I was just absolutely flooded with comments saying real mosaic would have been easier, so I want to get ahead of the comments on here and tell you that it absolutely would not have been easier. I would have had to cut each tile one by one, laid them. There are 16 stepping stones, so before you think of commenting that real mosaics would have been easier or better or superior in some way, sure, they will last longer, but there's just no way I could have done that. That's just so insanely unrealistic. Even if I ordered it custom, one little thing might be $1,000 and I have 16 custom stones. It's not happening. So here's how I did it in a way that worked for me. You don't have to do this. Let me just put that out there. You don't have to do this, and you don't have to be upset if mine doesn't last forever. This is a technique that I came up with. I'm not sure the paint will last forever. I started with chipping stepping stones. I might end with chipping stepping stones. I made sure to prime it, coat it multiple times, and I will continue to add a lacquer to it for as long as I can. I have no idea how this is gonna turn out. This is day one, but I am so excited about this process now that I got all the negativity out of the way. I can't wait to show you how I made these stepping stones. Now let's get into the video. This is what these stepping stones look like when I started the project / when we bought the house. This was after I had been walking on them on a rainy day, but they began chipping really badly. I'm not sure what caused it, and honestly, I don't remember if they were chipping that bad when we moved in, but the first thing I did was cut back this rosemary bush. It was absolutely massive when we moved in, and it's only gotten bigger. I hope I can move it. I'm not sure if that's the case, but at least I cut off the parts that were covering up the stones, and then I just began scraping all of the chipping paint, anything that was chipping off. I tried to scrape off. There were some bubbling parts, but I didn't do a perfect job. I just tried my best with the scraping. I also did some experimenting with paint stripper, which only stripped off the top pink part, so I abandoned that and I tried sanding for a little bit. This really didn't do very much either, so I kind of abandoned that as well after trying it on one stone. And then I realized if I wanted to paint the sides, I would have to move these rocks. At first, I was actually scooping them into a bucket, and then I was like, yeah, that's not gonna happen. So I just kind of pushed them all to the centers and moved them away from the sides so I could make sure that I was able to prime the sides and also paint them with the top coat. So there was kind of that side layer showing. And then I hosed them all off and made sure I got any dirt that I had dragged onto them during this cleaning process off. And then I made sure they dried for 24 hours before I went to Home Depot and got this primer that the paint specialist recommended. I used all of their recommendations after I described my project, and they said this was a really good primer. So I went in with a brush and I made sure to get all of the sides. I was initially just planning on only hand brushing the sides, and then I got carried away and was like, how much harder would it be to just hand paint the whole thing? And I wish I had gone back and just done it with a roller, but alas, I spent about 1,000,000 hours hand painting these. I did need to hand paint the sides because a roller wouldn't have worked with the sides, but I did waste a bit of time during this process just hand painting them and on my hands and knees, which kind of sucked. But I did make sure I get the sides really well, and the sides weren't painted very well before, so maybe that will help prevent some chipping, we'll see. Once I finished with my primer, I let it dry for the recommended amount of time, and then I went in with this porch and patio floor paint specifically meant for floors. I don't know why I wasn't standing during this process. I got this custom color. I wanted a dark brown for the grout lines so it looked worn, and I also want something that's gonna look good if it like chips and gets dirty. So that's why I chose this nice dark brown color, and I went in for my first coat with this roller brush, and then I did go back, which I'm not gonna show, and hand brush the sides to make sure they were painted as well. I wasn't sure how many coats this would require, but after looking at it dried, it definitely needed another coat. I was glad that I was able to end at 2 because I definitely could have gone for 3. I ended up taking off my shoes so I could stand on it and not get it dirty as I was painting, and I got an extension pole, which, like I said, I don't know why I didn't think of that before. It made this process so much easier for my second coat. Now, the most fun part of this whole process was drawing the design and planning it out. I hand drew every single tile. I just couldn't figure out how to make it exactly how I wanted it without hand drawing every single one. I tried ChatGPT, I tried making a brush in Procreate, I tried a bunch of different stuff, and this is what ended up working best, especially because they can't all be exact squares. With Roman tiles and Roman mosaics, they're cut into different shapes, all like squares, but you'll find some triangles and other stuff in there. So I wanted it to be perfect. I was able to use the symmetry tool on Procreate, which helped a lot, but I admit it still did take quite some time to do this. I think when I looked at the total, it was around 5 hours, which includes messing around with the initial design because I couldn't get it right at first, and doing, color tests and whatnot, but it took a long time. But I wanted it to be perfect, and it turned out exactly how I wanted it to. And here's a little time lapse of me drawing every single individual tile. It took forever. Once I finished the design, I removed the background and I brought it into Photoshop and I cropped it, and then I selected the pixels and I painted everything black because that's just easier for me to see and easier for my laser. Actually, I'm not sure of that, but it's easier for me to see. And then I created a grid because my laser can only cut certain sizes. I think maybe the maximum width is around 15 or 16 inches. So I needed each width to only be 15 or 16 inches. So each time I exported each one into my laser, I sketched them, which is a tool on my WeCreate laser that allows you to kind of trace the outline of it. And then I began cutting it out on my laser. I ended up using just these thin, I think they're birchwood sheets of wood. They're just like little cheap plywood that you can get on Amazon, just because that was easier for me. My personal laser doesn't cut like acrylic. I was thinking of potentially doing acetate, but my laser doesn't cut that. Here's what it looks like all laid out. I don't know if you can tell, they don't perfectly line up. I am pretty bad at math, so there were some gaps, but I actually just filled them with hot glue. And at this point, I'm using wood glue that I put on some plastic, and I'm dipping each side into it so I'm able to stick them all together. And it stuck together pretty well. By the end, it was kind of broken, but the blue tape that I added later ended up keeping everything together pretty well, and I didn't have to re-glue anything by the end of it. Once that dried, I was able to take it outside and, moment of truth, lay it down on the actual stones, and thank goodness it fit. I was a little bit terrified until I actually saw it on the stone and working. Then I took some blue tape and I lined each side. In order to do a curve, you want to take little tiny pieces and just place them along the curve. And Benny wanted to get his little dirty paw prints on this stone that I was at the very beginning being so careful about keeping clean. Like I was taking my shoes off and being so clean, and then by the end of it, I was being so messy. I did 2 layers of that blue tape, and why on earth would I do my first test one to be the very first step that you see? I don't know. I wasn't holding it down enough, and it did not turn out well. There was so much like seepage going on, and I should have known better because I had done smaller tests. So I don't know why I did that. Finally, I realized, oh my gosh, I need to hold this down section by section. So I had these gloves on, it was sticking, it was a mess, and it was really hot, but like I said, totally worth it. And then I proceeded to do that 16 different times. I was making kind of like a little V with my hand and then spray painting inside the V, and that was the most effective technique I could find. It was such a mess though. And then I would go back and spray paint any little parts that I missed. That was also really helpful to make sure there was a nice thick coat on everything. That really helped like show more contrast, which made it look more realistic, because I was realizing any of the kind of hazy parts weren't quite as realistic. I cannot express to you how relieved I was when I was done with this part of the process. This was by far the hardest, worst, not enjoyable part, but totally worth it. And honestly, I feel like it looks pretty good just on its own, especially if I had gone maybe like all the way to the border. Now I finally arrived at the fun part. I cut a brush to make sure it was the same width as these little tiles, and then initially, I can't believe I was going to do this, I was going to paint in all of the green ones individually, and there's quite a bit of green, and then I realized I could just use a light wash of the green and just paint over the design, and then I would go back and add thicker parts of paint to make it look different colors of green or different tones of green. And this was honestly so much fun. It just went on so easily, and I'm using, I think, exterior paint. We had gotten some samples for our house because our house is green as well. And so this was just one of the paint samples that we got to test out our house. We didn't end up going with it because it was too yellow, but this is just like a little Home Depot paint sample that I'm using. And this was, like I said, so much fun. It was like a coloring book. I was just sitting outside with Benny. I had the best time. Now for the yellow, I was hoping I could do the same technique, but I could not. So thankfully there wasn't as much yellow, but I did have to hand paint each square with a little bit of a smaller brush. And this still, I think I timed myself. It took either 5 or 10 minutes per one, and I'm just listening to my audiobook, having a good time as I'm doing all of this. At this point, I had made a huge mess around the edges. When I initially spray painted the white, there was a bunch of just white everywhere, so I did go back in with the brown paint and touched it up before I did the border. I made a custom stencil on my laser again, which I'm not going to show that process for this particular stencil, but I used the same exact process where I drew it out and I cut it on my laser, and then I glued the pieces together. It was just like a plain strip, nothing exciting. I think it was 2 or 3 pieces that I ended up gluing together. And then I blue taped it, and this was so much easier to spray because it was such a smaller part, so it wasn't coming up, and it went on really, really clean, and I didn't have any of the problems that I did before. But I was sick on the day that I was doing these borders, so I only filmed that one part because I was like dying. My nose was running so bad and I didn't want to film, so you only get that one shot. I then took that spray paint in and got it color matched and got this custom little sample from Home Depot so it would look exactly the same. And I took that first brush that I was using and I did all of the borders. I timed myself. These only took 5 minutes. This might actually have been my favorite part of the process. It was so satisfying. It went on so easily. And like I said, each one only took 5 minutes. It was so much fun. And I just didn't think a stencil made sense for the outside borders just because they were all kind of uneven. So there weren't the same amount of rows in each. So I think if I had tried to spray paint it, it would have been a huge mess, and honestly fixing it would have taken more than the 5 minutes this took to paint. After that was done, I went back and I mixed some white into the paint, and I added just some little pops of lightness to kind of mix it up and give it color variation, the same type of color variation you would see in normal natural Roman tile. And then I was ready to seal everything. I used this lacquer that the Home Depot paint specialist recommended for me. On the instructions, it says not to pour it directly on the surface or let it pool, and I definitely did that, so I don't recommend doing that. Do as I say, not as I do. I used a foam roller brush to ensure a nice even thin coat, and I wore gloves and a mask. This thing was very, very potent and had a bunch of warnings on it, so be careful as you're using this. And I ended up doing 2 coats of this, and I think I'll make like a quarterly tradition of adding 2 more coats. And this is what it looks like when it's dry and ready to go. It looks so good. I'm so happy with how it turned out. The main one who uses this pathway is Benny, and he seems to love it. He's very thrilled that he can walk on it again. I think it looks pretty convincing as a mosaic, and I can't wait to see how it looks with all of my landscaping all around it, nice and finished, and everything just put together. I cannot get over how well they turned out. One thing I didn't mention is I initially wanted to do the borders in yellow, and when I went to Home Depot, they were out of any like muted yellows. They had some really bright yellows, but nothing that worked, so that's why I chose the terracotta color. I personally don't love it, especially with the outside rocks being lava rocks. I think the colors clash. That being said, I don't plan on keeping those lava rocks. Hopefully I'll dig them out. I'm planning on planting some sort of a ground cover. I'm thinking maybe like creeping thyme or something like that. It does need to be a little bit drought resistant, and from the research that I've done, it seems like creeping thyme is pretty drought resistant and would do okay in my zone. So we'll see, but just wanted to put that out there because I'm not a huge fan of the terracotta and I think it's good to be honest, but this is not the end result. I'm also gonna do landscaping on either side because there's some like random cinder blocks and a bunch of like bright pink flowers, which doesn't really go with my aesthetic, my vibe. So I will be doing some landscaping and adding some purples and oranges, and hopefully it'll look like a cottage garden. And then the other goal is to remove that bush and then add some raised beds, because this is a pathway that leads to nothing or a bush as of right now. Add some raised beds and then put a fountain in the middle of it, and then have some fruit trees off to the left. So it is getting really, really hot out. I live in Southern California, so this might not happen this spring/summer because like I said, it's getting really warm, but we're gonna try to do as much as we can. So be sure to follow along to see how it turns out. Feel free to follow me on all of my other socials. I'm on TikTok, Instagram, everything at Y Street Studio. Thank you so much for watching and happy making.